could mention a couple things about the federal and the state. So hopefully everybody has been aware, because it's been in the news so much in the last few months. But the state has a process of redistricting that's very convoluted, but it was approved by the state, by the electorate twice, for congressional and then also for the state legislative districts. And both processes called really for a lot of nonpartisan or less partisan kinds of things in the process, so that there was a fair fairness has not prevailed, and the folks in charge, and I'll say it's the Republicans. If it were the Democrats, I'd be naming the Democrats, and in other states it is the Democrats. So this is a nonpartisan statement here, but the whole process in Ohio has been controlled by the Republicans, and they've basically ignored what the voters asked for several years ago, demanded really through a vote throughout the state. And the Ohio Supreme Court has ruled that they were unconstitutional maps, both the congressional map that was proposed and then finally approved by the Republican-dominated legislature, and also the General Assembly districts were maps. Several of them, a few of them, were rejected by the Ohio Supreme Court, and the Ohio Supreme Court is split Republican-Democrat appointees. But a key in this is that one of the the Chief Justice is a Republican, but she has sided with the democratically or the Democrat appointed justices on the Supreme Court in this case, because she has for quite a while now stated that she is opposed to highly partisan redistricting, and so she has lived up to her word on this. And but unfortunately, it's gone to the federal courts, and the federal courts are federal court has 3 judges involved in this, and only one was a Democratic appointed judge, and the other 2 were by Trump. And so they have ruled that if nothing happens at the state by the state courts, that they are going to impose one of the plans that the Republicans promoted. And so it's probably a foregone conclusion that we're going to have that what I call, and everybody else I think would agree, if you abide by the will of the voters, unfair districts. Anyway, that wasn't really the topic of my discussion. I'm going to get right into my local redistricting.
Okay, perfect. Okay. So thank you for the update. No, that was good insight. So thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to share my screen. Which one is it? It's that one, right? Is it that one? Sure, yeah. So are you seeing my shared screen? I
am seeing the PowerPoint presentation, but not the presentation mode. So okay. Yeah, now we're seeing it. Perfect.
Okay, good. All right.
Thanks.
So that's what I'm going to talk about, local applications of redistricting. I've been involved in that process quite a bit lately, especially. So, every 10 years, politicians are really interested in maps suddenly. And we all know why, because it affects them so much. And this last year, as I was saying, following the release of the 2020 census, the nation saw the redistricting of congressional and state legislative districts. And that process has been fraught with partisan and cultural and racial battles, and the public has been engaged as fans of one side or another. And geographic information systems technology shapes our political geography these days. It has for quite a while, and that affects public policies that impact our daily lives. So when legislation is passed by either state legislature or congressional law, how fairly those districts have been drawn and how representative our representatives are as a result of those boundaries really affects the laws that affect us on a daily basis. So gun laws, for example, has been unfortunately very hot again as a result. And I could go on about the policy implications, but I'm going to move on. So using web-based GIS, the public has been acting as watchdogs this time around. And while attention has been focused on the national picture, redistricting at the local level has also been happening and is very important. So I'm going to plug my book. ERISA published a book that I put together called Redistricting, a Guide for the GIS Community. That publication is available at the ERISA website. It costs $25 for ERISA members, $50 for non-members. That wasn't my decision. I wanted it to be available free for everybody, but they wanted to recover some costs. That publication does talk a little bit about local redistricting, but it's mostly focused on the congressional and state legislative process. I would point out that a colleague of mine, Blake Esselstein, produced a supplement to it. It's along with the document that talks about all the software that's available. So if you're really interested in the software for doing redistricting, I recommend you acquire the book and its supplement. So this presentation is going to talk about how redistricting at the local level works and provide some examples based on my experiences. I'm talking about city wards and county council districts. Those are the local kinds of redistricting I'm talking about. So there's a difference between the local and state and congressional districting in terms of who does it and the data and methods used even to some extent, and the criteria applied. And the kinds of products that are produced as a result. So I'm going to talk about all those things. The types of local legislative districts, some cities have at-large council people, and some have a mix of at-large and ward-based, geographically based council people, but mostly, cities have either a combination of at-large and district-based, or entirely district-based or geographically based representatives. So it's different from the state and legislative congressional districts, but also important. The council passes local laws and allocates budgets for a variety of purposes. So again, our daily lives are affected in our communities by redistricting at the local level. And the process at the local level is not as partisan as it is, I think, at the state and congressional level, but especially for more homogeneous communities where there's not a lot of variation in people's political outlooks or whatever, but where the larger cities, where there's a lot more of demographic variation in the city, then things can be much more heated in a partisan way. And political climates and the incumbents are more settled than in state and federal situations. And Trump has been, of course, less of a factor at the local level. Although issues about MAGA have shown their head, has shown its head to some extent, but not as much as at the state and federal level. So who does it? The folks that are involved include the council, of course, because they have to pass the redistricting plan as law, and often their law office of the municipality or the county is involved because it is a legal issue, and the mayor also in some cases can get involved, but has no other authority over it other than interest, I guess. And often they appoint a task force or a special committee, that is to say the council does. And then they're often it's either done in-house by some staff, but more often it's through consultants. And I've been one of those consultants on doing this kind of thing. So there are ethical considerations in this whole process, I would point out. As was pointed out this morning, our keynote speaker, there are ethical considerations to our work, and we should consult the GIS Code of Ethics if you're involved in redistricting. I pay close attention to it myself, making sure that there's transparency, that the public is aware of what's going on and throughout the process. And there are issues, of course, of equity and social justice involved in redistricting our local communities. And the public can be engaged, and I encourage it. There are 5 categories of such engagement. You can either allow them to, one way is to allow them to comment on proposed plans. Another is to have hearings made available with information, et cetera, that the public can pay attention to and comment on. Providing public notice on what's going on with the meetings so that people can attend public meetings. And even provide a procedure for citizens to seek court review of the enacted plans. And you can allow citizens to contribute their own maps as suggestions to the process for redistricting. And I've actually been an advocate of allowing the citizens more than just a passive role in that process, but that those maps ought to be acted on by the redistricting commission or group. This is a relatively complicated little graph that's in my book, but I'm going to skip through that and talk more about the process here. So the first question is, how many districts are required, and that may increase or decrease from after each census based on population changes. And you have to determine what the criteria are in order to draw those boundaries. And you should check the charter. So if you get involved in this process, the city charter or the county charter will have some requirements about it, and including the types of features to be used. And they rarely mention census blocks, which are the building blocks of this whole process. The census blocks have the population data. And consulting the stakeholders is important, not only the council people, but perhaps others. And as I said, the council is the one that actually adopts the plan. And this provides an opportunity for that public engagement that I talked about. And then you have to go out and get the key data. That's the next step. And that includes the Public Law 94-171 data, which is the census, the decennial census that, for example, the 2020 census that is provides data by census block on population and race. And a few other things, but that's the primary data set. And then you also have to probably have a map of the current districts or the current wards to see what kinds of changes are required by aggregating the block level data to those current wards. So you know the current population, the 2020 population, and then taking a look at the changes that have occurred and which wards might need tweaking or a radical revision, for example. Or you could start from scratch for that matter. And sometimes things like communities of interest are important. And there you can get data from the American Community Survey on educational income and poverty rates, other kinds of things that can be relevant to the process. So you need to analyze any overpopulation or underpopulation in the districts. We have a constitutional mandate to have as close a population as possible, and I'll get to that in a moment. And so you look at which districts are likely to require significant revisions. And you have to keep in mind that the changes to districts will require changes to adjacent districts, and that can have a domino effect throughout the whole process. Okay. And this is really where the negotiation occurs with various council people and their interest in protecting their own wards or districts. And then one creates one or more draft district plans, either from scratch or based on the current set and tweaking them, and negotiation in that process continues. And then allowing for public input is important, as I say. You can review, they can review draft plans, allow the public to submit draft plans, as I said, and then you might need to revise the district plans or the proposed plan based on that input. And then you might report steps. Whoops, that's 5 through 7. Sorry, I was tweaking it before. And an iterative process might have to draft additional plans that meet the concerns of various stakeholders. So there's more negotiation, and not everyone will be happy as a result, I can guarantee. And then finally, as I say, the council adopts the plan. And then as the consultant or the person working on these kinds of things for the council, then you have to provide a variety of things, including maps, of course, and shape files, and a block correspondence table of which blocks belong to which district. Perhaps a narrative description of the plan might be required, describing what street you go down and turn left and go down another street, etc. and maybe even a summarizing report about the plan and how it was derived. So the criteria I mentioned before, population equality is the #1 factor, and the plan must demonstrate, quote, an honest and good faith effort to construct districts as nearly of equal population as practical. That's a federal case that the Supreme Court heard and requires that any districting plan meet the constitutional mandate that one person, one vote be maintained to the extent possible. And generally speaking, at the local level, that means really being within plus or minus 5% of the average population in each of the districts or wards, or possibly a 10% range from the largest ward to the smallest ward. That's not quite the same thing, but it achieves the idea of being approximately equal in population. Other factors include district stability, perhaps, where you don't have to move very many voters from one ward to another. People get unhappy when they're told that their ward is no longer Ward 4; it's now, Ward 6. That can be confusing, and they maybe have a different polling place, for example. So, keeping district stability is often one of the criteria at a local level, at least, that the council looks for. And of course, you also have to obey the Voting Rights Act, which is, again, a requirement in the Constitution now, or because of the Constitution, the Voting Rights Act has been implemented, which basically says that you have to respect the needs of the voting preferences of minority groups. So a situation in which a municipality has a significant African-American population, you're not allowed to basically create districts that don't give them an opportunity to elect somebody of their preference. And it's more complicated than that, but that's another presentation entirely. Spatial continuity, that is to say, you can't have wards or districts that are separated in pieces, basically. And people like the idea of compactness. I'm less inclined to think compactness is important. These are all relative, except Voting Rights Act and equal population in importance. Compactness is often seen as something which is desirable. To me, it's only an indication about whether or not people have been screwing around with the lines to capture populations that they want. And communities of interest that I mentioned before, and the idea of fairness. If you're dealing with a partisan issue, you don't want to, you shouldn't, in my opinion, somebody involved in the process cater to one party or another who might be in control of the process and passing a plan. And so there are issues, conflicts of interest, partisanship, as I mentioned. The incumbents have their own interests. They want to maintain certain parts of their ward. They don't want to lose other parts of their ward. And there are all kinds of issues there. They have friends they want to keep in their ward. They have contributors they want to keep in their ward, or they even have relatives. I got to keep my grandmother in my ward is one thing I've heard, for example. Another incumbent council person said that, well, she wanted to move to a nicer part of her current ward, but the plan that we were looking at required that that section be in another ward, and so she was advocating strongly that we not do that. So those kinds of are the kinds of things that one encounters as a consultant to this process. So you need attribute data. That's the census data, for example. Next time I got, which is the public law 94/171. And then other demographic data and socioeconomic data if communities of interest are important. And if partisan issues are important, then you need to get the number of Republican and Democratic votes distributed so you can see where they are and how to distribute your boundaries to accommodate fairness in the likely results of elections. And the data on race I mentioned here, I should probably skip through this. Hopefully people know that the census provides data about six different race categories, including combinations of those. And then they also have data about Hispanic or Latino ancestry, and again that population by the various race categories. So there's it's a large data set, a large number of variables basically that one can look at in terms of the race issue. And this is just a graph showing that the data that you get in the Public Law 94-171 data set can be put into an Access database, and there are 4 tables. But you can also now, only recently, download those tables from the data.census.gov website as separate tables. Okay, and then of course you need GIS data, and generally we're talking about the Tiger data from the Census Bureau that includes those layers that we look at there, including the blocks particularly. And there's the voting districts, which are called VTDs, voting tabulation districts, I think is the origin of that. Those are really the precincts that are used locally, and they change. So the boards of elections are probably now revising their precinct boundaries that were developed for the 2021 redistricting process, and they change during the course of the decade. But currently, we have a set of VTDs that the Census Bureau put together, and Ohio participated in the program. So we have voting district or precinct level geography as well. And then roads and highways and rail and water are good for reference data in mapping and looking where the boundaries ought to be. So other locally important features might include property parcels and address points, or plat and subdivision maps. And the address and property parcels I've used, for example, when needing to split a block, where there's a reason that a block needs to be split between 2 or 3 or more wards. And you can use, because you have to estimate the population of the resulting wards, you can estimate the population based on allocating the population of the block into its component parts using locally available address points, for example. So I've done that where I've allocated by proportioning the number of single-family housing units on each side of the split block proposed boundary ward boundary. And that's illustrated here, where you might have a number of blocks which are in the gray lines, and then you have a precinct, for example, which splits those blocks, and you need to estimate the population on either side of the precinct boundary, the population of the block. And you can use, again, if you have it, address data or parcel data. Okay, so one of the possibilities was for me to actually show you one of the software systems, Dave's Redistricting app, which is available on the web, that a lot of watchdog organizations have been using to challenge the politicians' maps to show that they can produce something better, and they do almost always. Sure, in fact, I want to get rid of the word always. Almost always, the citizens produce fairer maps, I would say. So, by example, here's a community, and the existing wards are the red lines. And those are the 7 wards in that community. And so you can tabulate the Public Law 94-171 data by block up to the current district levels, these 7 districts, and you get the population, you get the data by race going across. And then you can calculate the deviation around the mean, that 5% around the mean. So in this case, because the 2020 population has changed the populations in those 7 wards, it shows that there's a variations of 13% negative in Ward 6, whereas Ward 5 has got an overpopulation now, and based on that 5% plus or minus criteria, there's some adjustment to the boundaries is required, and so you can do that. And then over here we've got simply the racial tally in this community. There weren't very many African Americans or people of other races, and so it's really not an issue. But in some communities it can be an issue. And looking at the proportion of African Americans in the one race category, or in the or of any of the categories, can be useful in assessing the degree to which you have to accommodate the Voting Rights Act, or respect the Voting Rights Act. You should always respect it. Whether or not you have to do anything about it depends on the demographics. And so zooming in on that deviation portion of the table there. And then if there is a Voting Rights Act issue, the Justice Department looks at the voting age population and its racial distribution. So you can also produce that data and those proportions. Okay, so one thing that we want to do is now we know that there's a overpopulation or underpopulation in 6 and overpopulation in 5. There must have been some sort of development in the last 10 years, and so you need to figure out, well, where does that line move? Well, it could simply be a matter of adjusting this boundary so that you pick up some population down here, and this is simply a map showing a dot density of population you can start with. And then you can also in doing this actually print the population numbers in each block, and this one zooms into that area, and you can see these are the population numbers in each census block, and you can decide, well, if I add these 37, 48, blah blah blah, maybe I can get my number up to in Ward 6 and taking away from Ward 5 to balance that discrepancy that we saw. So that's really what you're doing in adjusting the boundaries. And there's, as I say, there is software out there that can do this, a variety of them. And what I can show you, I was going to show you live, but it's probably quicker to do it in slides, is Dave's Redistricting. And this is the homepage. And this is an example of that same community where we're using Dave's application, and there are component parts of this system where you can move the boundary or select blocks that should get moved from one ward to another, and when you do that, you end up changing the population distribution. So this is the current population distribution in the wards, and if you go in and make some changes, then those numbers change, and you can allocate blocks to different wards, and the numbers change interactively. And you can also look at other issues and turn on different layers and that sort of thing, and that's what that does. And you can pick blocks or precincts to work with, to allocate, to move them from one district to another. And so this is that same area where you might think about moving some of these blocks to Ward 6. And there's some diagnostics that you can get in Dave's. First of all, if you click on some of these icons over here, you get maps. You can provide feedback to the people that maintain that system. You can export your map. You can share it on the web. You can tweet it. You can also look at the history of the development of the map that you're working on. You can also get help, and you can donate, because it's a free not-for-profit organization that runs Dave's. And you have an account. So some of these other things that you can click on, it includes getting statistics on what your map provides, and it provides a whole bunch of statistics. Here's the population, for example, that we're looking at. We haven't edited anything, and these columns tell you various things about whether or not they're splits and that sort of thing. And it's got the partisan lean data. So here's a blow up of what I was talking about here, and here's the partisan lean and the demographics of the district. And these will all change as you edit the map and come up with a new plan to propose for the next decade. So I really ran through that very quickly, and I hope that was useful. And so I'm ready to take questions.
What's Mark? So we have, well, first of all, Dick Katapish put a link in the chat to Dave's Redistricting app. So thank you for that, Dick. Dan Meany asked the question, what's the best source for current VTDs, Local Bureau of Elections or the Census Bureau?
That's a good question, actually. The Census Bureau provides it, for the whole state and for those states that participated in the program. So we're fortunate in Ohio to have the 2020 precincts. And to go with the 2020 census data, which you need to use, courts have ruled that that the 2020 census, or the decennial census, is the official data to use. Other communities have said, no, well, we use our own estimates, and the courts have basically thrown that out. So you got to use the decennial census. So it makes sense to use those voting tabulation districts. They can have errors. I've seen errors in that database. They're not major errors. They're, really relatively very minor errors when compared to what the counties produced. If you have the local county precincts, that's fine. If they line up with census geography, and that may be an issue, they may not be based on the same base map, and you may have to conflate them so they do line up with census blocks. So there are issues there.
I have a question regarding the, obviously redistricting is heavily partisan, like you've alluded to, and just listening to in radio that in Georgia there was a phenomena that was occurring where they said that Democrats were taking Republican ballots for the primary. A question that I have is that what is the data that's being used to determine political leaning? I would assume it is registration to political party. And in Ohio, it depends on what ballot you take as to what party you're registered to, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, but they don't use. I've never heard anybody using the primaries to do this. It's the people who vote in the general election, and there's less, swapping parties in order to get somebody to run against the person you really want, who's weaker. That's what you're hearing about with the Georgia case. I don't know to what extent that's true. I'm sure to some extent it is. But the data that has been used in Ohio, for example, on looking at the partisan issue at the state and congressional level, has been data from several elections prior, including 2020, but prior to 2020 as well, to come up with an index aggregating the number of votes for Republicans and Democratic in major races, and they come up with an index. And that's that 46% ratio that the courts have said would represent the Republican versus Democrat proportionality that is required by the Constitution. Now that now that it's required to adequately represent the partisanship and not unduly favor one party or another. And so the 46% has been held as the proper ratio to acquire in drawing those new congressional or general assembly districts, and that's based on a composite of those prior races.
It's a general election race. It's
Yeah,
not party. It's not party designation. It's how previously people had voted. Correct?
Yeah, for either the Republican or Democratic candidates.
Right.
We don't have a strong third party situation here.
Yes.
They can also look at the registration, of course, but they haven't. I haven't heard anybody talking about the registration proportions in this situation. They've all looked at the prior election results.
Okay. I'm just curious because I'd heard anecdotally that that's what had happened in Georgia, and so I wasn't sure if that was used to sway. But very good. We have 3 o'clock at the top of the hour. Mark, if you wouldn't mind hanging around in the panelist area, if anybody has any additional questions, you can answer directly in